Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at day number 2 of the Super United Rapid and Blitz Chess Tournament, which is being played in Zagreb, Croatia, as part of the Grand Chess Tour. Now, yesterday we were covering the games of the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen, but we failed to mention the current world champion Gukesh Domoraju. Now, before we get into our recap for today, I want to start with an important tweet that was put out by a tweet that was published with a quote from Magnus Carlsen right before the event began. Now, you guys see the tweet on the screen, and it's a quote from Carlsen. It says, "Gukesh hasn't done anything to indicate that he's going to do well in such a tournament. I hope for his sake that he can play better, but playing him this tournament, I will approach it as I'm playing one of the presumably weaker players in the tournament." Now, you're probably thinking, wow, what a bunch of disrespect from Magnus. Having said that, however, Gukesh's big weakness in recent times has been in Rapid and Blitz. He's well established as one of the best, if not the best, classical chess player at the moment, with some very, very remarkable performances. Nonetheless, one thing that I think Magnus slightly underestimates is that Gukesh is still only 18 years old. He's a very young kid still. He has a lot of room to improve. And I would also give you another comparison, which is that until his mid-20s, Fabiano Caruana, the current world number 3 player, actually was someone that was considered to be weak in Rapid and Blitz. He was considered to be a beast in classical chess, but really weak in the other formats. Fabiano, however, was able to improve a lot, and nowadays when you see Fabiano playing in various events, you don't think of him as a weak player in Rapid or Blitz. So plenty of time for Gukesh to prove the haters wrong. Now, we're going to talk about the first day a little bit. On the first day, Gukesh started with a very tough loss with the black pieces against Jan Krzysztof Dudov from Poland, and probably already people were thinking, well, Magnus is right once again. Gukesh is going to struggle in this event. So that's probably what you're thinking, but Gukesh would have a very important win in the second game with the white piece against Alireza Firouzja. It was a topsy-turvy game, but eventually he would come out on top, and Gukesh would actually finish the day with a second win in a row against Ramesh Babu Pragnanand. So Gukesh wins 2 games to end day 1, is back in the hunt to potentially compete, maybe even win the rapid portion, and we're now jump into the action with the first game of the day. So round number 4, Gukesh on a 2-game winning streak, and he's playing with the black pieces against Nodirbek Abdusattorov. So the game starts with the move d4. Gukesh plays knight to f6, we get c4, and now we have the move e6. Here Nodirbek plays move knight to c3, we get the move bishop b4, and this of course is the classic Nimzo Indian defense. We get queen c2, d5, a3, takes, castles, and now the move knight f3. Here we get the move knight b to d2, bishop g5 is played, and now Gukesh plays b6. Nodirbek trades on d5, plays move e3, and we get the move c5. Now, you might be noticing that I'm going through this opening a little bit quicker. I did see some comments from people yesterday saying that my recap was a little bit too long in terms of one of the games, so we're going to try to get a little bit more into the action a bit quicker. So we get the move bishop b5. Gukesh plays h6, we get bishop h4, and now we get the move a5. Now, you probably have noticed from the evaluation bar that this is a big mistake here from Gukesh. Computer loves white's position here. White has the 2 Bs here on some great diagonals, and also there's a weak pawn on c5. But at the end of the day, it is still a rapid game. So we get bishop to c6 here, and this is the first step in the wrong direction. Now, here the computer wanted Nodirbek to trade on c5, trade on d7 here, and after the move bishop d7, white can simply take the pawn on c5 here and castle the king on the next turn. Let's say you get rook c8, for example. After queen to a7, if black goes bishop b5, now I think you have a4. If the bishop moves, let's just say c4, for example, you can go b3, takes, castles, and white is much better here as black has 2 serious weaknesses. There's also a pin still on the board, and white is doing very well. So Nodirbek should have taken on c5, but instead we get the move bishop c6. Now Gukesh plays rook to a7, and here we get pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now we get the move bishop takes knight on d7. Now here Nodirbek has confused the order very slightly. He's helped black improve the rook position. The rook on a7 here does some stuff on the 7th rank potentially, whereas on a8 it wouldn't be doing anything at all. So we get rook takes bishop. And here Nodirbek plays move queen takes pawn on c5. Now, we're obviously doing this recap focusing on Gukesh, but I do want to spend a second to talk about Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Nodirbek is a very, very talented player. In my opinion, one of the great rising stars, one of the kids who has the best chance to become a future world championship or champion contender. But one thing I've noticed is sometimes he loses, folks. He's a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too optimistic. Most recently, we saw this in the Uzi chess tournament that was played in Uzbekistan, where Nodirbek was leading from start to finish, but in the final round of the event, he went guns blazing all in with the white pieces against Pragnanantov, trying to win in a situation where he only needed a draw to win the tournament. Ultimately, he would get outplayed and lose that game, and he ended up not even finishing in the top 2. So that is one thing I've noticed, and this is another case where I feel like Nodirbek starts to be a little bit too optimistic here. What he should have done is he should have simply gone into an end game by trading everything off and castling to the queen side, or maybe playing a move like rook c1 here. It's nothing super special, but there's zero risk involved, and only white can play for the win. Whereas in the game, what happens here is that Nodirbek ends up playing the move queen takes pawn, and now after bishop to a6, suddenly this great bishop on the diagonal cuts off the king. You can no longer castle the king, and that means both the king and the rook here are kind of stranded. You don't ever want to castle queenside because there's going to be a rook c7 simply picking off the queen on c5 here. So because of this move bishop a6 and this very powerful bishop in general, white has serious problems in development. Now, you'll also notice, of course, from the evaluation bar that things are turning. The computer already thinks black is better. So we get the move queen to d4. Of course, we get g5 from Gukesh. You have to break this pin here. If you were to play a move like queen e7, white can simply trade. And in this position, after queen g4, let's say king h7, white can play a move like knight to d4. Let's say you go rook c8, for example. And after the move h4 with the idea of rook h3 and rook g3, white is very close to winning. So we get g5. Nodirbek drops back, we get knight to e4, and already here this is very scary. Black is the great bishop. You can put the rook or the queen on the open files potentially. There's also an open c file, and with this king and the rook simply out of the game, it's very tough to play. To make matters worse, this is of course a rapid game to boot, meaning that you don't have all the time in the world. This is a position which I think in classical chess would be very defendable if you were playing from the white side. With time ticking down and no ability to think for 10 or 15 minutes on a single move, it's going to be very difficult. And this also highlights the difference in certain positions in rapid versus classical. I think in classical this is completely fine from the white side. In a rapid or blitz game, I think this position is very, very tough to play, and you're very likely going to lose. So we get the move rook c1. Gukesh plays queen to a8 here. This move is designed to try and bring the other tower into the game with rook to c8 here. And now we get the move queen d1. Here, Gukesh plays the move rook c8, missing a golden opportunity to end the game on the spot. Now, if Gukesh were to play this move pawn to d4, black is actually winning here, because if white were to take with the pawn, you trade the knight for the bishop, and after rook to e8, suddenly this king is stuck in the middle of the board. After king to d2, for example, you can play g4. Knight is weak, pawn is weak. You move the knight, you lose the queen. If you don't move the knight, let's say you play rook h6, I simply take, and with the king being here on d2, white will lose the game. So Gukesh misses the opportunity. He plays rook to c8, and now we get the move knight to d4 here, stopping Gukesh from pushing the pawn, and we get the move knight c5. Now in this position, Nodirbek plays the move rook to c2. We get the move a4 here. This is a move simply designed to lock the horse on c5. If black were to say go king h8, ignoring everything that can happen on the rest of the board, white can potentially try to play b4, removing this knight from c5. So we get a4, stopping white from playing b4, because if white were to play b4, this would lose due to the classic end peasant maneuver. You play pawn takes pawn here. Looks like the glitch move, but as we know, this is legal in the game of chess, or it has been for 300 years, and black wins. So here we get the move king d2, and this is a move that is purely a panic move from Nodirbek here. He's really afraid of this move knight to d3, checking the king and forking everything, and he just panics and plays this move. Now, what's amazing about this position is that the computer says that if white plays move h4, trying to open up this king side, bring the queen, bring the rook into the game, at this point, white is actually only marginally worse after knight d3, king d2, takes, rook b7, and now the move rook to b1. Main reason for that here is that this knight can jump to f5. Let's say you got bishop c4 and white trades and plays something like queen c3. You have knight to f5 here. There's no way to break through, and actually the king on d2 here is very, very secure. Instead, we get to move king to d2. Now Gukesh plays rook b7, and as you guys can tell from the valuation bar, everything is going wrong here because white is simply too slow to try and open up the king side. We get queen c1 played. Probably h4 would have been the best attempt, but after h4, there's bishop to d3 here. The knight guards the bishop. If you move the rook, there's knight e4, or even rook takes b2. Everything is collapsing here. This king is horribly placed. There's even queen to a5 on top of it, so it's all over. So we get queen to c1. Gukesh plays bishop c4 here, stopping white from being able to win the knight on c5, and now we get the move f3. Gukesh plays queen a5 check, we get king to d1, and now we get the move knight to b3 here, forking the knight and the queen. Now, if white were to trade the knights on b3, after bishop takes b3 is played, the rook is pinned here. You can play something like bishop e1, but after bishop takes c2, takes, and let's just say rook takes b2, for example. Black is going to win this game. You have two rooks versus a bishop and a rook. This rook on h1 has never left its home square, and this is just a very easy conversion. So after knight b3, we get bishop to e1, and after the move queen to a6, Nodirbek Abdusattorov resigns the game here because basically you can't trade the knights because of the aforementioned pin, and if you don't move the queen, you lose the queen, and if you move the queen, it's the same problem. I trade the horses, I go bishop b3, collecting this rook on the diagonal, and it's just awful, and you will resign or get mated in a couple of turns. So we get a 27 move masterpiece from Gukesh, his third win in a row in this event, and suddenly Gukesh is really trying to prove the haters wrong, and Magnus is looking like he might have an egg on his face. So Gukesh wins his third game in a row, and now we're going to jump to the second game where Gukesh has the white piece against Fabiano. Gukesh on a 3-game win streak. Fabiano not having a great event. Just my personal observation, having watched the event so far over the first 2 days, is that Fabiano seems a little bit rusty, a little bit out of it. I don't think he's been studying a lot of chess lately. Probably just getting a bit of a vacation away from the game of chess, so he is not quite in form. Gukesh, however, 3 games in a row, trying to ride the wave and win his 4th game against Fabiano. So we get knight to f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, c4, bishop e7, and now we get the move b3. We get castles, and here Gukesh plays the move bishop b2. Now, in one of the games that I recapped yesterday between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So, it was a very similar opening, but after castles and c5, I believe that what Magnus played was takes, knight c3, knight c6, and bishop b2, with the king being castle. Now, sort of freeze this position in your mind, because when we come back to the game that's being played between Gukesh and Fabiano, we get something very similar, but here Gukesh plays move h4 instead of transposing by castling his king out of the center. So we get h4, Gukesh trying to push the h pawn, trying to play in the legendary style of the great computer program AlphaZero. You will note that AlphaZero, Leela Stockfish, all the programs these days, they love to push pawns to h4, and in these Catalan structures specifically, it has become a common theme. In fact, Magnus Carlsen himself has tried to play for some of these maneuvers. Just to give you one specific example, in the regular Catalan, I believe there is a specific line with what is it? There's some line I'm trying to remember. I think it might be like b5, a4, c6, where I think white can play h4 here. I might have the exact order wrong, but there are many variations where when you fianchetto Cheeto the bishop on the diagonal, you do push the h pawn. So back to the game. After h4, Fabiano plays knight f6, we get castles, and now we get the move e5 being played. Now here Fabiano is trying to grip the center with these pawns on c5 and e5 to stop white from ever being able to play d4. Now the reason that Fabiano is doing this is, if we look at this fundamentally, or conceptually I should say, if white is ever able to get a position like this, you'll notice that the bishop is on this great diagonal. In the long term, you can open up the scope. But in this position with the pawn on e5, you can't really push d4, and if you play a move like knight a4 and bishop d6, this bishop, it looks nice, but it's not really doing a whole lot on the diagonal. So after e5, Gukesh plays move rook c1, Fabiano goes bishop f5, and now we get the move pawn to d3. Fabi plays rook c8, we get knight to d2, and now we get the move bishop to e6. Gukesh plays knight c4, and here we get the move knight g4. Now this is a very, very nice move from Fabiano because the knight overprotects the pawn on e5 from being captured, but because white has pushed this pawn to h4 and created a bit of a weakness, the knight has a great home here. For example, if white were to never play h4, just going back, let's just say you get some position very similar with something like this, for example. If you go knight g4 here, white always has h3 to kick the knight out of town, and the knight will have to retreat. So when Fabi goes knight g4, he's taking advantage of this pawn not being able to target the knight, and now we get the move e3. Now here Fabiano plays move h5, missing a great opportunity. Now, as I mentioned, in my view, looking at these games so far, it seems that Fabiano is a little bit rusty, and here he simply misses a pretty straightforward tactic. Now, the tactic that exists in this position is bishop takes h4, sacking the bishop. If white were to take the bishop after queen takes h4, you're threatening to checkmate this white king on g1. White's got to move the rook to avoid the mate in Uno, but after takes, king h1, check, king g1, What's the win? Computer wants check in f5, which is good enough, but even something like queen to h2, king f1, and f5, where black is pushing the f pawn and this white king is on an open file eventually, is going to be devastating, and black will win the game every time. Probably what Fabiano did see is either he did not see this tactic at all, or maybe he assumed there's some move that white could play here, like bishop to f3, for example, attacking the knight. But after f5, you still keep this idea of queen takes h4 in play, and white is in all kinds of trouble. The other line that maybe Fabiano missed is he might have thought there was bishop d5 here, and after takes queen g4, he might have thought, well, both the bishops are on pre and I'm going to lose a piece. But after bishop to f6, the queen guards the bishop, and now black simply has one extra pawn here. So Fabi misses this opportunity. He instead plays move h5, trying to lock this temporary bastion knight on g4. We get the move queen e2, and now we have a6 being played. Gukesh plays rook d1, we get b5, knight d2, and here Fabiano plays the move f5. Now Gukesh goes knight to f3, and in this position Fabiano makes a huge mistake with the move bishop to f6. Now I'm not really sure why Fabiano played this move. As I said, I get the sense he's a little bit rusty. I suspect this was simply an oversight and he just missed some kind of weird calculation error here. But what happens after bishop f6 is now white can in fact play d4, and out of nowhere the center of the board is opening up. White has the rooks on the great C and D files here, and black's pieces are misplaced, and black is in all kinds of trouble. Now what Fabiano should have played here was a move like bishop to f7, because now if white goes d4 in this position, you can simply take and play this move e4 here, and if white goes d5, you simply take the knight and move your knight away, and black is up a piece. Whereas in the game, after we get bishop f6 d4, now if you were to take and play e4, for example, white can go d5 because the bishop is on this file. If you take, I take the bishop with check, take the knight, and now white suddenly is going to be on the right side of this position. So here Fabiano spent a lot of time. I think he spent something like 7 minutes before making his next turn. Ultimately, he plays the move e4. Gukesh goes d5, the best move in the position. We get takes, takes, and now we get the move knight e5. We get pawn takes bishop, takes, takes, queen to e7, and now it's time to take stock of the position. White is temporarily up a pawn here. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Black is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here we get the move knight to d5. Fabiano captures, we get the trade, and now Gukesh plays the move queen takes f5, trying to sack the queen. Now white could of course trade the knights as well and take the pawn on h5 to be up a pawn in the endgame, but the computer in fact loves this capture, because after you take the pawn, Fabi has to capture the queen. You get knight e7 with the classic family fork. We get king h7, knight takes queen, and now we're in an endgame where white has one extra pawn, 6 versus 5, but much more importantly, white has 4 pawns on the king side versus 2. So black has a 3-on-2 majority on the queen side here in terms of pawns, but when you have connected pawns in the center in an endgame, that is what you want, and technically speaking, this is very close to winning. So here Fabi goes rook c7, we get knight d6, rook d8, and now we get the move e4. Fabi plays rook d7, we get e5, knight e4, and now we get the move rook e1. Now Gukesh would be unable to take what looks like a free pony, because after takes, 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 suddenly black has a rook versus a knight, and black goes on to win the game. So we get rook to e1, Fabiano trades, we get rook c8, rook e5, king h6, takes, 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 and now we've reached an endgame where Gukesh has one extra pawn. It's a rook and pawn endgame with a 5 versus 4, but this is one of the endgames where white is actually technically winning, and primarily it's because black has too many weaknesses here. The white king is very close to the center of the board. You're gonna have to protect your pawns, but most importantly, you can't force a trade. If black could get something like this, for example, where the pawns get split, black has great chance to save the game, but you can't do that in the structure because of the pawn being on h5, meaning that with the pawns being fixed and without g5, this kingside pawn structure can never be touched, and therefore all the focus here is going to be about the queenside pawns. So Fabiano plays rook e6, we get a4, takes, takes, g6, a5, king g7, king g2, rook f6, and now Gukesh puts the rook on a7, permanently attacking the pawn on a6, but also stopping this black king from ever getting back into the game. So we get the move rook c6, Gukesh plays king f3, and now we get the move rook e6, king f4, rook c6, and Gukesh plays king e4. We get rook e6, king d4, rook d6, king c5, and now we get the move rook to d2. Now, Gukesh has been able to bring the king very close to this pawn on a5. At this point, Fabiano has to try to go for some counterplay, because if you keep waiting with, say, rook to e6, for example, white will just go f4, and then at the right moment, you go rook c7. If rook e6, you have rook c6 here, and if you try to check the king, now the king gets right here on b6, where it attacks the pawn, guards the white pawn, and this is just a very rudimentary, elementary, I should say, endgame where white will win every time. So Fabi plays rook d2. We get f4, rook c2, king to d5, rook d2, king to e5, and now we get check, king d5, king c6, and the move rook d3. Now you're probably thinking, why did Gukesh do this dilly-dally, moving the king to e5 and e6? Main reason is because he gains a little bit of time. That's a little bit more time to think. You know that at this point in the game, you're going to need some time to try to calculate this rook and pawn endgame. So it's not like he was aiming for a draw. It was simply a good ploy, or a good tactic, to gain a little bit more time to think. So we get king c6. Fabi plays rook d3, we get rook takes a6, and now we get to move rook g3, and here king b7 is played by Gukesh, putting the king on a very nice square here, where it will support the pawn thrust to a8. The king supports both these two squares when you start pushing the p, and at this point Fabiano could more or less resign. We get rook to f3 here. If Fabi were to play the move rook to a3, trying to stop white from moving the rook off, for example, then white can go f5, winning the pawn on g6 due to the pin. So we get rook f3, Gukesh plays rook f6, king g7, and now we get to move rook to c6. Now, rook f6 is a very, very classy move here, because the only chance for black to save the game potentially is to get something like this. This actually still winning apparently, but the reason that you want the king on h6 is that at the right moment, if the king is here, the king can come forward and help escort the pawn down the board. When you go rook f6, king g7, and rook c6, now the king is back. The king cannot get to this fourth rank to escort the pawn up the board very quickly. So even though we get rook takes pawn and a6 is played, here Fabiano simply resigns the game, because after rook takes h4, white will go a7, rook to a4, rook to a6, and after check, white will slowly just bring the king all the way back. You make a queen, and even though black has two pawns here, the white king gets back. The king and the rook will stop these two pawns from moving up the board, and this will be a simple win. Additionally here, if you were to not play rook takes h4, say you go g5, or let me give you a better example. Say you were to get some position like this, just to illustrate the point. You get some position like this. If black were able to get this position with the king and the pawn going up the board, this is a draw here. But when we reach this position, if black plays g5, after white goes a7, for example, rook to a4, rook a6 check, white can once again simply bring the king all the way back. And at this point, after takes, king e4, the king is too close. The black king never gets in the game, and this is very easy. So Gukesh wins a second game in a row, and his fourth in a row in the tournament. He's on absolute fire. He's now leapfrogged to the top of the field, where he is the clear leader by 1 point over Magnus Carlsen, Jan Krzysztof Duda, and a handful of others. So what does that mean? That means, of course, in the third and final game of the day, Gukesh obviously has the black pieces against the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus is obviously very strong, but he has had some iffy moments in this event. Now, after I did my recap yesterday of the Magnus Duda game, I realized that Duda missed an opportunity to win at the end, and in today's games, Magnus was actually in a lot of trouble and probably should have lost in the very first game of the day against Alireza Firouzja. He was able to get a draw. He drew the next game. He just doesn't seem to be quite in form either. But Gukesh, however, is on a 4-game winning streak, and after the epic viral moment with the table bang when Gukesh beat Magnus in their last encounter, you gotta know that Magnus is out for blood. So Magnus and Gukesh are playing here, and the game starts out with the move c4. Gukesh plays the move e5, we get the move knight to c3, and now we get the move bishop to b4. Here, Magnus plays knight to f3. It's worth pointing out that this, of course, is the English system that Gukesh did play against Ding Liren in their World Championship match. So it's very clear that Gukesh is not playing around. He's bringing his A game to the table because of this important moment. So here we get the move knight to f3. Now we get bishop takes knight, Magnus captures, and we get the move d6. Now at this point, white has the two Bs already, the bishop combination, but white has double pawns on c4 and c3. So we get the move d6 e4, we get knight d7, bishop d3, knight c5, bishop c2. Of course, white wants to preserve the bishop combo because in the long run, the bishops can be very active, as we saw in Magnus's game against Wesley So yesterday. So we get the move knight to f6. Magnus plays queen e2, we get a5 here, and now we have the move knight to d2. Here Gukesh plays g6, and this is the first move which is a step in the wrong direction. Now at this point both players are very clearly out of their theory. I'm not sure why Gukesh played the move g6 here. It's a rather peculiar decision to play this move versus say playing h6 for example, or a move like bishop to e6. Only Gukesh can explain, but even though it seems a little bit awkward because you create some weaknesses on the dark squares, it's not all that bad in reality. So we get knight to f1. Magnus, we get knight to f1, bishop e6 is played by Gukesh, we get bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and now we get the move queen to d7. Here Magnus plays the move f3, and now we get the move knight to h5. Now this game actually gives me some shades of a couple of games I played against Magnus where I pushed pawns very quickly, I brought pieces out. Very specifically a game I played against him in Tata Steel, and I believe 2013 if I'm not mistaken, where I was pushing my pawns. My knights looked very good early. It was a Kalashnikov Sicilian, but slowly but surely he pushed my pieces back, and what looked very promising at first turned into a big nothing burger. So we get knight to e3, and actually when I was watching the game live, I had these thoughts in my mind. Here Gukesh plays knight to f4, we get queen d2, and now we get the very enterprising move pawn to b5. Now what's amazing about this move b5 is the computer actually loves this move, but there's one specific reason, and from a human vantage point, and more specifically in Rapid and Blitz, the reason this move is so good is simply not human. Now Magnus plays the move knight to d5, very logical move. If white were to play b4 after takes, black has the exciting option rook to a3 here, because even though you sack the horse, after rook takes e3, if white takes, there's knight g2, forking the king and the queen, and black wins the game. After rook to a3, white is actually still better here, I think, after castles, but the game gets very murky after knight to d3. It's very hard to judge what is going on, and Magnus no doubt didn't want to go into a big tactical skirmish. So after b5, Magnus plays the move knight d5. Now here Gukesh plays bishop takes knight, and this is one of the most important things in the game of chess, and one of the hardest things to explain to someone, which is that computers will always give you what is considered to be the best move or the absolute best variation, but there's some situations where the best moves are simply not possible to find as a human, and this is one great example. In this position, the computer thinks that black is fine after the very obvious move king to d8. Now this move is important because if black were to play say pawn takes pawn, after knight f6 you fork the king and the queen and you win the game. So king d8 and black is completely fine, but from a human perspective, and more specifically in Rapid or Blitz, you don't have time to think for 10 or 15 minutes. It's just not a natural move, and I don't think anybody frankly would play this move in a game. So Gukesh plays what you would expect a human to play. He takes the horse. We get pawn takes bishop, but now after the move knight to h5 and bishop f2 here, white has the two Bs, and at this point black is in a lot of trouble here, as you can tell, because black doesn't really have a safe haven for the king. Black has pushed the pawns on both sides of the board, so you can't easily castle. If you go this way, after b4, let's say takes, knight a6 and a4, you are getting massacred on the queen side here. This king is going to just get checkmated very quickly. And if you were to try to go the other way and castle king side, white can go h4 here, and suddenly you have all kinds of problems on your king side. So this is a very bad position. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this has shades of the game I played against Magnus. This looks like a Magnus Supreme. He's got the two bishops, his opponent does not have a safe king, and it's very easy to play with limited to no tactics on the board. So Gukesh plays king f8. Magnus goes g3 here, trying to stop knight back to f4. Sorry, I can't draw the arrows here. And now we get to move king g7. Magnus plays bishop to e3, we get queen to e7, and here Magnus decides to play the move rook g1. Now this is a move that I thought was very strange. It was very confusing to me. I didn't really understand this move. I expected Magnus to simply castle the king here, and let's just say black were to play a move like, I don't know, rook to c8 or something. Then white can go b4 here, and after takes, knight a4, bishop d3, the pawn is weak, or something like knight d7, bishop d3 with rook c1 coming here. White's king is very safe on the king side here. There are no issues at all, and white should simply win the game very easily. So I was very surprised to see Magnus play rook to g1 here, because even though his king is still safe on e1, now white won't have the standard development by castling to the king side. And with these pawns being on b5 and a5 here, let's just say black were to play a move like rook g8 as a sample line. If white tries to castle after b4, for example, and rook b8 incoming, black does have potential to create counterplay on the queen side. Doesn't mean that this isn't terrible, but there is some potential for a phantom attack. So Gukesh plays knight f6, and now Magnus goes for the move b4, and this is simply a move that I do not understand for the life of me. This really flies in the face of everything that I've seen from Magnus as a player over the last decade plus, because here Magnus has a great positional bind. He's got the two bishops here. He can slowly push the knight back. He can castle queenside still, maybe even king f1, king g2, something along these lines. Why does he play b4? Now, the reason I'm so critical of this move is because after takes a knight to a4, now white doesn't really have the same safe harbor on the queen side by castling the king anymore. Now the rook on g1 looks a little bit misplaced because you can't castle king side. And even though it still should be much better for white, it's starting to veer in the wrong direction. So here we get bishop d3 from Magnus. Now Gukesh plays the move c6, and this is an excellent decision here. And to me, it's very clear that Magnus probably thought he was just coasting here. There's no counterplay. But once Gukesh played the move c6, I started thinking, uh-oh, this is going to become a tactical game. This is not a position Magnus is going to like. And there are real chances that Gukesh could turn this completely around from being where he was much worse, if not positionally lost, to maybe even winning the game. Now, the reason is that after takes and d5, even though temporarily white is up a pawn, this king is very open in the center. The files are opening. The d file is about to open. The e file might open. D's knights are getting very active. And because of that, this is a tough position to play. And it's also not a style of play that Magnus particularly likes. Magnus is a guy who likes slow positional grinds. He doesn't want these big tactical skirmishes. He tries very hard to avoid them. And so at this point, Gukesh has everything he could dream of. And let's see if Magnus will be able to keep it together. So Magnus trades. We get the move a3 here, guarding the pawn on b4. And now Gukesh plays the move rook d8. Magnus goes rook c1, and here we get the move rook to d6. Now, the reason this position is so chaotic here is that there's no clear-cut plan for Magnus. He has to worry about this pin on the d file. He has to worry about rook d8, d's knights jumping every which way. It's just a very tough position to play with no clear concept, which also means you're going to have to burn your time. Now, at this point in the game, I believe both players had about 6 minutes on the clock, but Gukesh is in a much better situation because his moves are going to be reactionary to whatever Magnus comes up with as a plan. So a sample line is, say white goes king to f2, for example. Gukesh can think about queen to f6. He can think about rook to d8. He can think about something like knight to f6. Gukesh has very, very limited options here, whereas Magnus has to calculate, because if he makes one big slip, say he were to play a move like, I don't know, bishop to f5, for example, after something like knight to f4, very quickly you could make a one-move blunder and end up in a losing position. Now, I understand this is not actually losing here because white can still go queen c2, but the point is the threats exist and it's very hard to play. So Magnus decides to go for the move bishop takes b5, and now we get the move knight dc3, where the knights guard each other, and you create the fossil by attacking the queen and the bishop at the same time. Magnus goes bishop to c5 here, an excellent move, because if black were to go rook takes queen, you take the queen, the bishop covers this critical e2 square, rook is on pre, and after, say, rook takes h2, bishop takes a4, knight takes a4, and c7, all the dust, all the complications have cleared, and white is simply winning with all this p on the queen side. So after bishop c5, Gukesh correctly plays the move knight takes bishop. You get bishop takes rook, knight takes bishop, and at this point, Magnus now has two rooks versus a rook and two knights. But the big issue for Magnus here is king safety. This king is not in a great position here with this rook being on g1. Frankly, I think if Magnus were able to castle, let me just set this up randomly. If Magnus were able to castle here, white is actually winning the game, ironically enough. But because Magnus is unable to castle after having played that mysterious rook g1 move earlier, this position is not better for white. So what does Magnus do? He plays the logical human move, king to f2, trying to manually castle the king and now get his rooks on the open files, either the e or the d file. Gukesh here plays move knight b6, an excellent move, bringing the knight back. Most importantly, the pawns cannot really advance. If white goes c7, black can simply take, because d's knights stop the pawns. Let's say rook c6 and knight c8 even, b5, rook b3. The pawns are simply not getting through. The pawns are being blockaded by the knights. With the pawns unable to advance very quickly, that is why Gukesh has no worries whatsoever here. The knights stop the pawn. The rook is attacking this pawn. The king is in the middle of the board. Black has so many ideas here that at this point, I was pretty confident that Gukesh was going to win this game and beat Magnus once again. So we get the move queen to d3 from Magnus, trying to guard the pawn on a3, and now we get the move queen to e6. Now, the reason that Gukesh goes queen e6 here is he understands that what he needs to do is put the knight on c4 here. These knights guard each other, the rook targets the pawn, and you still have e4. But most importantly, the knights are also getting a little bit closer towards this white king on g2. So after queen to e6, Magnus plays the move rook c5, and this is a huge error after which there really is no coming back. What Magnus needed to play here is he simply needed to run the king to g2 here, and after knight c4 and rook to c3, black is still probably fine after a move like rook to a6 or maybe g4, but the king is on a grade square on g2. You can bring the rooks to the center of the board and you still have a lot of hope. But Magnus tries to go for the immediate counterplay with rook c5, but Gukesh shuts it down in a heartbeat. He plays this move e4, and now everything is loose. Not only is your king on the wrong square, not only is the pawn weak, not only can the queen go to a2, but now you have to deal with this e pawn coming out the board, also queen to h3. There are simply way too many threats to deal with. So we get queen d4, and now Gukesh plays the move king to g8. Computer says this is very slightly wrong, but in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with it. You could play f6, which is better, but to me, king g8 makes a lot of sense, simply because with the king here, there's no way to attack the king. If you were to go f6, you always worry there might be a long-term threat on the 7th rank or on the diagonal. So from a human standpoint, I see nothing wrong with this move. But after king to g8, Magnus now plays the move rook to d1, and after this move, the game is officially over, and Gukesh does not let it slip. We get the move pawn takes pawn here. Magnus cannot grab the horsey on d6, because after queen to e2 check, king g1, queen to g2, this would of course be the classic lolly checkmate, and Magnus does not want to get lolly mated. So after e takes f3, Magnus has to do something to stop the queen e2 threat, but the problem now is the knights are so active, the queen is active, the rook is on a perfect square on a8, hitting the pawn on a3. So Magnus goes rook to e5. And now Gukesh plays the move queen to h3, setting up the same checkmate ideas with the queen and the pawn. Now, if Magnus were to take this knight here on d6, for example, after queen to g2, if you go king e3, there's knight c4, creating the family fork once again. And if you don't go to e3 and you go to e1, black simply goes f2, you move your king, I queen the pawn with check on the king, and with two queens on the board, this is going to be a very quick checkmate here with the king on b1 getting stuck. So we get the move king takes f3 being played here by Magnus, and now we get the move knight b to c4. Now after knight b c4 is played in this position, the knights guard each other, the knight targets the rook on e5, and you have rook a3 coming in with check on the next turn. So after knight b c4, Magnus, now in desperation mode with 20 seconds on the clock, plays the move rook to a5, sacking the rook, but also trying to stop Gukesh from taking this pawn with check, attacking the king. Gukesh takes, Magnus plays b takes a5, and now we get to move queen to f5, checking the king. After queen to f5, we get king to g2, and now Gukesh plays queen c2, checking the king, attacking the pawn. With all these pawns being split on islands, no longer being connected, this position is simply lost for Magnus no matter what he does. Just to explain what I mean by split pawns, if you could get these pawns rolling up the board, say somehow, I don't know, let me just set this up randomly, you get some position like this, for example, with all these pawns connected, they can escort each other down the board potentially, and there are some hopes for a miracle. But as you can see, these pawns are all split. The pawns on the a file are going nowhere. There's a rook on this file, which will always stop the pawns. So if Gukesh can capture the pawn on c6, that will be all she wrote. So we get the move king to g1. Gukesh plays knight to f5 here, attacking the queen. Queen attacks the rook and the pawn here. And now after knight to f5, Magnus plays the move queen d7. Gukesh goes knight to e3, attacking the rook, but also setting up the dirty checkmate threat. If white moves the rook to, say, d6, there's queen g2, and it's checkmate gg. So after knight to e3 is played here, Magnus plays rook d2. We get queen c1 check, king to f2 being played, and now we get the move knight g4, checking the king. Now here, Magnus would love to take the horse, but then you lose the rook, so you can't do that. After knight to g4, we get the move king to e2, and now Gukesh plays the move knight to e5, forking the queen and the pawn. Black is going to collect the pawn on c6, and now there is no hope for any miracle at all. So after we get the move knight to e5 being played, Magnus goes queen to e7, we get the move knight takes c6, and after queen to e4, Gukesh plays the move rook takes a5, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns the game. You cannot play rook d8 check because black would simply take the rook. If you play queen e8, king g7, there are no checks here of the king. Black's going to play rook e5 next move. With the extra horse on the board, the white king is going to get checkmated, or you'll have to give up a lot of pieces to dodge mate. Either way, the game will end in Gukesh's favor. So after this move, rook takes a5, Magnus Carlsen resigns the game. Gukesh wins a 5th game in a row, and most importantly, he beats Magnus for a 2nd time in a row. Sure, Magnus was better, if not winning at some moment early in the game, but Gukesh shows great resiliency. He keeps playing in the position, and actually to me what this starts to show is that I think we're seeing a little bit of this Gukesh effect, where Magnus is now starting to doubt himself and make mistakes, because when we look at this game fundamentally from the start, Magnus had a great position. He had the bishop pair. Gukesh created a lot of weakness, pushes his pawns. So 2 bishops, save king. Gukesh pushing pawns, piece on the edge of the board. This is a game that old Magnus, I think, would have won most of the time. But I think we're starting to see a bit of this Gukesh effect, where it's starting to affect Magnus in a certain way. And he is not actually doing very well. So even if it's only 1 or 2 games, Gukesh is showing that he is no slouch. Most importantly, he's proving Magnus wrong after Magnus's comment about being one of the presumably weaker opponents in the field. So it's great to see that Gukesh is doing well. This also, I would say, adds a lot of hype to the event, because with Gukesh playing so well, now we're starting to see an event which is wide open. Now, if Gukesh maintains this quality through the rest of the event, including the blitz, he probably wins. But if he slips up, there's still a lot of room for other players to catch up. So I think it's going to be a very exciting event. Tomorrow, of course, there are 3 more rapid games. It's going to be really exciting to see what happens in those 3 games. But for right now, Gukesh is the man of the day, the man of the tournament, showing that even if traditionally he hasn't had great results in rapid chess, it is still chess at the end of the day. And if he finds the right moves, he gets the good positions, and he gets that groove going, he can become an unstoppable force. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from day number 2 of the Grand Chess Tour event being held in Zagreb, Croatia. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back with a recap tomorrow as the rapid portion concludes. Let's see if Gukesh can continue to keep his streak alive, or if Magnus gets angry, goes beast mode and wins. Who knows what will happen, but at any rate, a very exciting day. I hope you guys enjoyed the recap, and I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye.